The crystalline transport ship hummed with nervous energy as representatives from 12 different species sat in their designated containment fields. Marcus Rodriguez checked his restraints for the 100th time, his calloused hands finding no give in the alien metal. The restraints were smooth, seamless, probably grown rather than manufactured, he mused. Even their prison technology was beyond human understanding. Welcome, primitive beings, the voice echoed through universal translators, cold and mechanical. You have been selected for the Grand Survival Challenge, a test broadcast across 17 star systems for the entertainment of civilized species. Marcus had been expecting this ever since the Galactic Federation had made contact with Earth 5 years ago. Humanity had been classified as a Class C primitive species barely above the threshold for sapience recognition. The fact that they'd been invited to participate in anything was probably meant as a joke. A holographic display materialized in the center of the transport bay, shimmering with impossible clarity. The speaker was a tall, ethereal being with translucent skin and 4 arms, a Zephyrian, one of the galaxy's most advanced species. Their cities floated in the clouds of gas giants, powered by technologies that harvested energy from solar winds. The rules are simple, the alien continued, its voice carrying the bored tone of someone who'd given this speech many times before. You will be dropped on a Class M wilderness planet. No technology beyond your species' natural capabilities. No weapons. No tools. The last 3 survivors will be granted citizenship in the Galactic Federation. Marcus glanced around at his fellow contestants. The others looked terrified. A slug-like Malarian whose species had mastered biotechnology, a crystalline quartz person who could communicate through harmonic resonance, several insectoid species with natural chemical factories in their bodies, and others he couldn't identify. They were all wringing their appendages or making distressed noises through their translators. The irony wasn't lost on him. These were all species that had achieved interstellar travel, mastered physics that humans could barely comprehend, created technologies that seemed like magic. Yet here they were, panicking at the thought of being dropped in the wilderness without their gadgets. What about clothes? Asked a bipedal reptilian creature, its scaled hide glistening under the ship's artificial lighting. Basic environmental protection only. Nothing that could be considered technology. But how will we make shelter? Find food? Create fire? The questions came rapid-fire from different species, each one sounding more desperate than the last. Marcus listened to their concerns with growing amazement. Fire? These beings had mastered fusion reactors and they were worried about making fire? The Malarian was asking about food identification when their species had colonized dozens of worlds. The crystalline being was inquiring about water purification when they literally lived in the vacuum of space. All survival must be accomplished through your species' natural abilities, the Zephyrian repeated with obvious irritation. No artificial aids. No manufactured tools. No technological assistance of any kind. Marcus almost smiled. These aliens had no idea what they were dealing with. While they'd been busy inventing star drives and gravity manipulators, humanity had spent 2 million years perfecting the art of not dying in hostile environments. Every human alive carried the genetic memory of ancestors who had survived ice ages, predators, plagues, and famines using nothing but their wits and whatever they could scrape together from their surroundings. The other contestants were lamenting the loss of their technology. Marcus was already mentally cataloging everything he knew about wilderness survival, from his marine training to his years as a survival instructor. This wasn't going to be a competition, it was going to be a masterclass, and he was the only one qualified to teach it. The drop pods screamed through the atmosphere like meteors, their heat shields glowing cherry red as they punched through the planet's upper atmosphere. Marcus felt the familiar surge of adrenaline as his pod's retrothrusters fired, cushioning his landing in what appeared to be a dense forest. The impact jarred his teeth, but he'd experienced worse during his marine days. As the pod hissed open with a pneumatic sigh, he took his first breath of alien air. Clean, with a slightly higher oxygen content than Earth, maybe 22% instead of 21. The gravity felt about 0.8 standard, making him feel lighter on his feet. Not bad conditions at all. Through the fading daylight, he could see his pod had carved a furrow through the forest floor, scattering leaves and disturbing what looked like a small animal burrow. The local wildlife was already returning. He could hear chirping, rustling, and the distant call of something that sounded almost like a loon. He stepped out and immediately began his assessment, falling back on decades of training. The terrain was gently rolling hills covered in deciduous trees, similar to oak and maple but with slightly different leaf patterns. A stream gurgled nearby. He could hear it clearly in the stillness. The sun was setting, painting the sky in familiar oranges and purples through the canopy. While other contestants were likely still trying to figure out how to open their pods, he'd heard at least 3 emergency beacon activations in the distance. Marcus was already moving with purpose. He'd been a Marine for 8 years, then a survival instructor for the Forest Service, then a wilderness guide in Alaska. This was just another day at the office, albeit with slightly different trees. First priority, water. He followed the sound of the stream, automatically noting edible plants along the way. Wild berries that looked similar to elderberries, nuts that resembled walnuts, what appeared to be wild onions growing in a marshy area. The stream was clear and fast-moving over a rocky bottom, probably safe to drink, but he'd boil it to be sure. No point in getting sick from alien bacteria on day 1. Which brought him to priority 2, fire. The forest floor was rich with tinder, dry bark, dead grasses, fallen leaves. He found a sheltered spot near the stream and began gathering materials. First, a fire ring of stones to contain the flames. Then he collected wood in 3 sizes, tinder, kindling, and fuel wood. The local would seem dense and resinous. It would burn hot and long. By the time the alien sun had fully set, painting the forest in deep purples and blues, Marcus had a small fire crackling merrily in his circle of stones. He'd used the bow drill method, creating a bow from a flexible branch and using it to spin a wooden spindle against a fireboard until the friction created an ember. The tinder caught, the kindling flared, and soon he had a proper fire going. His reflection danced in the flames as he roasted some of the nuts he'd gathered, testing them carefully before eating. They tasted like a cross between pecans and hazelnuts, rich and oily, perfect for energy. In the distance, he could hear the confused and frightened calls of other contestants. Some were crying for help in languages his universal translator couldn't parse. Others were making distress calls that sounded like electronic bleeps and whistles. They were probably still trying to figure out how to make shelter or even how to get out of their pods. Marcus settled back against a tree, feeding his fire and planning his next day's activities. He'd scout for better shelter materials, set up some basic traps, maybe try to catch some fish from the stream. The night was full of sounds, insects, small mammals, the distant howl of something larger. But none of it sounded immediately threatening. This was going to be easier than he'd thought. Marcus woke before dawn, as was his habit. The alien constellations were still visible through the canopy, strange patterns of lights that would have been beautiful if he'd had time to appreciate them. The fire had burned down to a perfect bed of coals, glowing orange and red in the pre-dawn darkness. Perfect for cooking. He'd spent part of the night working by firelight, constructing a fish weir in the stream using stones and interwoven branches. The principle was simple: create a funnel that fish could swim into but couldn't easily escape from. By morning, he'd caught 3 fish, each about the size of a trout but with slightly different coloring and fin patterns. The smell of roasting fish over the coals would probably attract the others, but Marcus wasn't worried. He positioned his camp strategically, near fresh water, with good sight lines and multiple escape routes if needed. Old habits from Afghanistan died hard. As the alien sun crested the horizon, painting the forest in shades of gold and green, he heard the first sounds of approaching footsteps. Heavy, clumsy movement through the underbrush, accompanied by what sounded like cursing in a language his translator couldn't quite parse. The reptilian creature from the transport emerged into his small clearing, his scaled hide torn in several places from thorns and branches. His eyes were wide with amazement as he took in the scene. The controlled fire, the smell of cooking food, the neat arrangement of Marcus's camp. How did you make fire?" the alien gasped, his translator struggling with the concept as if it were trying to translate magic. "Friction," Marcus replied simply, turning his fish to cook evenly. "You rub 2 sticks together really fast. The wood fibers heat up from the friction until they reach ignition temperature. Then you add tinder and gradually build up to larger fuel." The reptilian, who'd introduced himself as Keth during the transport, stared at him as if he'd just performed some impossible feat of engineering. "But that's technology." "No," Marcus said patiently, drawing on his years of teaching wilderness survival. "Technology is using tools to make other tools, using external energy sources, creating complex systems. This is just applied physics. Friction creates heat, heat creates fire, fire cooks food and provides warmth. My species has been doing this for nearly 2 million years." More contestants began arriving, drawn by the smoke and the smell of cooked protein. The insectoid creature, Zrix, chittered in what sounded like excitement, his compound eyes reflecting the firelight like dozens of tiny mirrors. The crystalline being actually seemed to be vibrating with some kind of energy field, creating a low harmonic hum. "This is impossible," wheezed the Malarian as it oozed into the clearing, leaving a trail of bioluminescent slime. "Fire requires complex chemical reactions, precise temperature control, specialized equipment." "Nope," Marcus said, taking a bite of his fish. It tasted like a cross between salmon and bass, rich and flaky. "Just need the right materials and know-how. Want some?" "I caught extra." "Share food," demanded the Malarian, its slug-like body pulsing with what might have been indignation. "Cooperation is survival protocol. Resources must be distributed equally for optimal group survival." Marcus looked up from his breakfast, his expression hardening slightly. "I caught it. I cooked it. I planned ahead and worked while you were probably still trying to figure out how to open your pod. You want food, you contribute something to the group effort. But cooperation is the key to survival," protested Zrix, his mandibles clicking rapidly. "All species know this fundamental truth." "Sure is," Marcus agreed, gesturing with his improvised fish fork, a sharpened stick. "You bring something to the table, we cooperate. You scout for edible plants, help gather firewood, assist with shelter construction, share useful information about the local environment. But you just want handouts because you think survival is supposed to be easy." He shrugged and took another bite of fish. "That's not cooperation. That's charity. And charity doesn't keep people alive in the wilderness." The clearing fell silent except for the crackling of the fire and the distant sounds of the waking forest. Marcus could see the gears turning in their alien minds, the realization that their assumptions about survival, about cooperation, about the natural order of things might be fundamentally wrong. By the third day, Marcus had established himself as the undisputed leader of the group. Not through force or intimidation, but through simple competence that bordered on the supernatural in the eyes of his alien companions. While the others were still struggling with basic survival concepts like staying dry and finding edible food, he transformed their small clearing into something resembling a permanent settlement. His lean-to shelter was a masterpiece of engineering using only natural materials, branches woven together and sealed with mud and grass, positioned to catch the morning sun while staying protected from the prevailing winds. He'd fashioned a spear from a straight oak-like branch, fire-hardening the tip and lashing a carefully napped flint point to create a weapon that could take down large game. But it was his current project that really drew attention. Marcus sat cross-legged on a flat stone, a pile of flint chips growing around him as he worked. In his hands, he held what was clearly becoming a knife, a sharp, symmetrical blade with a wrapped handle. "That's definitely technology," complained the Zephyrian observer who materialized periodically to check on the contestants. The translucent being's forearms gestured frantically at Marcus's work. "Stone tools are clearly beyond natural capability. This violates the fundamental parameters of the competition." Marcus looked up from where he was napping flint, his movements precise and economical. Each strike of the hammerstone removed exactly the flake he intended, gradually shaping the blade through thousands of years of inherited knowledge. "Says who? My species has been making stone tools for 2 million years. Hell, we were making tools before we even figured out how to make fire reliably. It's as natural to us as breathing." "Impossible." The alien observer flickered with what might have been indignation. "Tool use requires advanced cognitive development, complex planning, abstract thinking. These are hallmarks of technological civilization. Maybe for you folks," Marcus said, testing the edge of his new knife against his thumb and nodding with satisfaction. A thin line of blood appeared, the blade was razor-sharp. "But humans? We've been making fire, tools, and weapons since before we even figured out agriculture. We were crafting spear points when your ancestors were probably still figuring out how to process energy from their local star." The alien observer's form shimmered with confusion. "The database shows your species only achieved spaceflight 200 of your standard years ago. How could you have been using tools for millions of years?" "Yeah, well," Marcus said, beginning work on a handle wrap made from plant fibers. "We were busy perfecting the important stuff first. Space travel is impressive, but it doesn't keep you alive when you're stranded on a hostile world with nothing but your wits." Around the camp, his alien companions watched with fascination. Keth had proven surprisingly adept at mimicking Marcus's techniques, though his reptilian hands struggled with the fine motor control required for napping. Zrix had discovered that his compound eyes could detect flaws in stone that were invisible to other species, making him an excellent spotter for good raw materials. "Why do you teach us?" asked Keth that evening as they sat around the fire, sharing a meal of roasted fish and gathered vegetables. "In our culture, knowledge is power. Powerful knowledge is closely guarded." "Because I'm not stupid," Marcus replied, working on his latest project, a bow carved from a flexible branch with a string made from twisted plant fibers. 11 of us started. 9 are left. Eventually, we're going to encounter something on this planet that's bigger, meaner, and hungrier than we are. When that happens, I'd rather have allies who know how to fight than deadweight who can't even make fire. The Malarian, who had been silently observing, suddenly pulsed with bioluminescent patterns. "You speak of inevitable conflict. This suggests advanced strategic thinking." "No," Marcus said, stringing his bow and testing the draw weight. "This suggests common sense. Everything alive wants to stay that way. The things that eat other things to stay alive are usually pretty good at it. We're soft, slow, and smell like food. Our only advantage is that we can think ahead and make tools to even the odds." He knocked an arrow, a straight shaft with a fire-hardened point, and drew the bow. The projectile flew straight and true, embedding itself in a tree trunk 30 meters away. "Tomorrow," he said, "we start hunting lessons." On the 5th day, they encountered their first real threat. Marcus heard the low growl first, a sound that resonated in his bones and made every survival instinct in his body scream danger. It came from the deep forest, beyond the morning mist that still clung to the trees. He raised his hand, signaling the others to freeze. Keth had been gathering firewood, Zrix was up in a tree collecting nuts, and the Malarian was filtering water through a sand and charcoal system Marcus had taught them to build. All activity stopped at his gesture. The other contestants went rigid with terror as a creature emerged from the underbrush like something from a nightmare. It was massive, easily the size of an earth grizzly bear, but built like a predator that evolution had been perfecting for millions of years. 6 powerful legs ended in claws that could shred metal, and its head was dominated by tusks like a saber-toothed tiger. But it was the eyes that marked it as truly dangerous. Intelligent, calculating, weighing its options. This was an apex predator that had learned to hunt thinking prey. "Nobody move," Marcus whispered, his voice barely audible but carrying absolute authority. "Don't run. Running triggers the chase response. Back away slowly toward the fire." The beast circled them with predatory patience, testing their resolve. Its nostrils flared as it caught their scent, and Marcus could see the moment it decided they were prey. The muscles in its haunches bunched as it prepared to charge. While the others cowered behind him, Marcus stepped forward, his spear held low and ready. Years of hunting dangerous game had taught him to read body language, to anticipate the moment of attack. His heart hammered against his ribs, but his hands were steady. "You can't fight that thing with a stick," Keth whispered, his reptilian voice cracking with fear. "Watch me," Marcus muttered back, shifting his weight to the balls of his feet. The creature feinted left, then right, testing his reactions. Marcus turned with it, keeping the spear point between them, never breaking eye contact. In the wilderness, showing fear was a death sentence. The beast's patience finally ran out. It charged with terrifying speed, 6 legs propelling its massive bulk forward like a living battering ram. Marcus had perhaps 2 seconds to react. He planted his feet and thrust upward at a precise angle, the fire-hardened point of his spear aimed not at the chest where thick muscle and bone would stop it, but at the soft spot where the neck met the shoulder. The beast's own momentum carried it onto the weapon, the wooden shaft driving deep into its body as physics and leverage did the work his muscles couldn't. The impact drove Marcus backward, his feet sliding in the forest loam, but the spear held. The creature's weight and velocity carried it past him, the wooden shaft snapping but leaving the stone point buried deep in vital organs. The beast stumbled, its 6 legs tangling, and crashed into a tree with bone-shaking force. It tried to rise, roared once in defiance, then collapsed as blood loss and shock overwhelmed its massive frame. The silence that followed was deafening. Even the forest seemed to hold its breath. "How?" whispered Zrix, his compound eyes fixed on the dead predator. "How did you know where to strike?" "Anatomy," Marcus said simply, retrieving what was left of his spear and already scanning the area for more threats. "Every predator has the same weak points. You just have to know where to look and have the nerve to exploit them." That night, they feasted on roasted meat while Marcus worked on tanning the hide using the creature's own brain tissue. Another technique that seemed like magic to his companions. The alien observers had been conspicuously absent since the fight, their monitoring drones keeping a much greater distance than before. "This is unprecedented," the Zephyrian council member stated, his forearms gesturing frantically at the holographic display that dominated the observation chamber. The images showed Marcus teaching Keth how to properly grip a spear, while Zrix practiced with a sling made from woven plant fibers. The human is clearly using advanced technology disguised as primitive methods. "Fire isn't technology," replied another council member. "This one a gas form being contained in a crystalline shell that pulsed with soft blue light. It's a natural phenomenon. Even some non-sapient species can create fire under specific circumstances. But controlled fire is. And those tools stone knapping requires metallurgy knowledge, understanding of crystal lattice structures, advanced physics." The Zephyrian's translucent form shimmered with agitation. "The spear construction alone demonstrates knowledge of leverage mechanics, material science, and tactical combat theory." "No," said a third voice, gravelly and ancient as shifting mountains. The speaker was a granite form, one of the oldest species in the galaxy, whose race had achieved spaceflight when most of the current council members' ancestors were still single-celled organisms. "I've studied the human databases extensively since first contact. They really did develop these skills before they even discovered agriculture. Before they built permanent settlements. Before they developed written language. They're not cheating, they're just fundamentally different from us." The viewing chamber fell silent as they watched the human demonstrate how to set snares for small game, his movements economical and practiced. What had started as a simple survival competition was becoming something else entirely, a masterclass in adaptation that challenged everything they thought they knew about technological development. "Observe their learning curve," the granite form continued, his bass voice rumbling through the chamber's crystalline walls. "The reptilian has mastered fire starting in 3 days. The insectoid is crafting tools that would take our finest artisans weeks to produce. Even the malarian, despite lacking manipulator appendages, has learned to identify dozens of edible plants." On the display, Marcus was showing the group how to smoke meat for preservation, constructing an elaborate rack system over a low fire. The aliens worked alongside him with enthusiasm that bordered on reverence, each species contributing their unique abilities to the collective effort. "Should we intervene?" asked the Zephyrian, his form flickering with uncertainty. "The competition parameters clearly state." "What parameters are being violated?" The granite form's question carried the weight of eons. "They're using no manufactured tools, no external energy sources, no pre-existing technology. Everything they've created comes from raw materials and knowledge. The fact that human knowledge includes skills we consider impossible doesn't invalidate the competition." Another council member, a crystalline being that communicated through harmonic resonance, chimed in with bell-like tones. "The cooperation between species is also unprecedented. Historical data shows that most survival competitions result in territorial behavior, resource hoarding, and eventual conflict. The humans call it force multiplication," the granite form explained, pulling up data streams that floated in the air like golden threads. "They don't just survive, they thrive. And they make everyone around them more capable in the process. It's not just about individual survival, it's about group optimization." On the screen, Marcus had constructed what could only be described as a primitive but functional weather station using bent branches and hanging stones to predict approaching storms. He was explaining wind patterns to his companions, teaching them to read the sky like a vast information display. "Look at the psychological profiles," the granite form continued. "The other contestants' stress levels have dropped by 60% since forming this alliance. Their problem-solving capabilities have increased exponentially. The human isn't just teaching them skills, he's teaching them to think like survivors." A new voice entered the discussion, wispy and ethereal, belonging to energy form consciousness. "Perhaps this is why they achieved spaceflight so recently. They were too busy perfecting survival to worry about leaving their planet." Or, the granite form rumbled with what might have been amusement, "They only left their planet when they were absolutely certain they could survive anywhere they went." 3 weeks into the competition, the remaining contestants had built what could only be described as a small village. Marcus had taught them to make pottery from river clay, firing it in kilns constructed from stones and mud. They'd learned to smoke meat for preservation, to construct complex shelters that could withstand the planet's frequent storms, and to read weather patterns in the movement of clouds and wind. More importantly, he taught them to think like humans, to see problems not as insurmountable obstacles but as puzzles waiting for creative solutions. The key, he explained to Keth as they worked on an elaborate fish trap system that would automatically sort catches by size, isn't to adapt to your environment. It's to adapt your environment to you. The fish trap was a marvel of primitive engineering, a series of woven baskets with decreasing openings that funneled fish into holding areas while allowing smaller ones to escape. Zrix had contributed his superior depth perception to ensure the angles were perfect, while the Malarian slime trail had proved unexpectedly useful as a waterproof sealant. The final challenge came not from the planet but from above. The familiar hum of anti-gravity engines filled the air as the Zephyrian ship descended through the canopy, its boarding ramps extending like metallic tongues. The contestants looked up from their various tasks. Some were tending the smoking racks, others were working on a primitive but effective water wheel that ground grain from local seeds. "Congratulations," announced the same cold voice that had greeted them weeks ago, though it now carried a note of confusion. "You have all survived the trial. This is highly unusual." Marcus looked up from where he was adding another fish to their sophisticated smokehouse, a structure that would have impressed any frontier settler. "Define survived. You are all still alive and in good health." The competition was specifically designed to eliminate contestants through natural selection until only 3 remained. This outcome was not anticipated in any of our probability models. "Yeah, well," Marcus shrugged, wiping his hands on a piece of tanned hide, "we decided to change the rules." The Zephyrian materialized in their clearing, his translucent form shimmering with visible agitation. Multiple recording devices hovered around him like technological attendants. "You cannot simply change the rules. This is a sanctioned competition with established parameters. There are broadcasting contracts, betting pools, cultural exchanges dependent on these outcomes." "No," Marcus said firmly, standing to face the alien observer. "This was a test of survival, adaptation, and cooperation. And we passed. All of us. That's not how competitions work. There must be winners and losers, hierarchies established, dominance patterns." "Look around," Marcus interrupted, gesturing to their thriving settlement. "You wanted to see who could survive. We didn't just survive, we built something. We created a society from scratch. We turned strangers into family, competitors into collaborators." The alien observer was quiet for a long moment, his 4 arms hanging limply at his sides. Finally, he spoke, his voice carrying a note of something that might have been wonder. "The council wishes to speak with you. All of you." "Of course they do," Marcus replied. "But we go as equals. We're not specimens anymore, we're partners." Around the clearing, his companions stood straighter. Keth's scaled hide gleamed with pride. Zrix's compound eyes reflected the afternoon sunlight like prisms. Even the Malarian pulsed with bioluminescent patterns that Marcus had learned indicated satisfaction and confidence. They had become something none of the galactic observers had anticipated, not just survivors, but pioneers. Not just individuals fighting for themselves, but a community that had transcended the boundaries of species, physiology, and evolutionary history. "We're ready," Marcus said simply. "But we're going together." The Zephyrian nodded slowly, perhaps beginning to understand that humanity's greatest strength wasn't their tools or their fire or their weapons, it was their refusal to leave anyone behind. 6 months later, Marcus stood in the Galactic Federation's council chambers, representing not just humanity but the entire Survivors Coalition. The alliance that had formed between the species that had learned to work together on that distant world. "Your species continues to confound us," the granite form counselor rumbled. "You had fire, tools, and weapons before most species even learned to communicate. Yet you use these advantages not to dominate but to elevate others." Marcus smiled. "That's what humans do. We're not just survivors, we're teachers. And there's nothing more human than making sure everyone comes home." The council chambers erupted in what passed for applause among a dozen different species. In the end, it wasn't humanity's tools or weapons that impressed the galaxy, it was their refusal to use them selfishly. Sometimes, the most primitive solution is the most advanced one of all.